Hello, and welcome to another episode of Captive Minds. I'm Max Perry. I'm an independent journalist based in Baltimore, Maryland. I'll be your host for the day. And with me, as always, is my co-host and fellow muckraker, our producer as well, Shaenah Batterson, who joins us from Eugene, Oregon. Hey, Shaenah.
Hi, Max. It's good to be doing another episode.
Yeah, after a brief hiatus, actually kind of a long one, we just want to apologize to our viewers for being gone for so long. I think it's been over a month since our last episode, but we've both
Yes.
been busy with various projects and also both took a much needed vacation. So we're glad to be back though after being gone for some time. Um, Obviously, so much has happened in the last month. It'd be impossible really to sum it all up. But the recent developments, whether it's Iran or all the stuff about the Epstein files, definitely relates to our topic for the day. In the last month, obviously, there's been the U.S. attack on Iran, and also, as many people think it's related, the ongoing revelations about Jeffrey Epstein.
Actually, 65,000 files have been deleted from the Epstein files since the beginning of the war on Iran.
Well, I certainly hope that they're being archived. I'm sure they are. But yeah, obviously, the late financier, who is widely believed to have been at the center of what appears to be a global sex trafficking conspiracy involving many of the world's leading public figures and politicians and so on, including a past and possibly current U.S. president, which many believe may be impacting his decision to finally pull the trigger on this Iran conflict after much enticement by the Israelis, which seem to have a really outsized or disproportionate level of influence on his administration. I mean, all U.S. presidential administrations have been pro-Israel, but this one really seems to be out and out in support of the Zionist entity. But, while this war has gone on, the Epstein scandal really has also captured the public imagination across the political aisle and just is not going away, no matter how much Trump seems to wag the dog. And of course, there seems to be the prevailing belief about Epstein, which I myself share, which is that as John Kiriakou, the former CIA officer who blew the whistle on the agency's torture program during the War on Terror, as he speculated, Epstein was some kind of Israeli access agent who was, wielding influence on the powerful through sexual blackmail and other forms of coercion and dragooning. There are actually, believe it or not, some contrarian journalists out there trying to deny this or cast doubt on these accusations about Epstein. But uh, I think if you look at the evidence, his connections to intelligence, including the CIA and Israel, are pretty overwhelmingly clear. The way that he obtained his wealth is even very questionable and is probably related to the sexual blackmail that I'm speaking of. I mean, specifically of the retail tycoon Leslie Wexner, who's, if you don't know, is the owner of Victoria's Secret and this has a retail empire, who I guess in the late 80s, early 90s, basically handed over a significant quantity of his wealth over to Epstein, who was his power of attorney. And that's where actually the intelligence connection becomes quite apparent because Epstein, he was known to have run in the same elite circles as, prominent arms dealers like, for example, Adnan Khashoggi, who was one of the middlemen in the Iran-Contra scandal. And Epstein specifically, basically, there was a cargo airline that was used in the Iran-Contra transactions or arms deals that it was basically a CIA front company. It had been a long time front airline for the agency going back to the U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia and the war in Vietnam, where the CIA, we've talked about it on this podcast before on our episodes on drugs. They had numerous front airlines that were involved in drug trafficking that were subsidizing for example, the Lao Hmong guerrillas in Laos that were fighting communists and the North Vietnamese. And basically, that airline was also involved in Iran-Contra. Well, there was Air America, but there was also another one called Southern Air Transport, and this is the one that Epstein became implicated with because I guess at some point after Iran-Contra, that cargo airline called Southern Air Transport. You can read about all this, by the way, in Whitney Webb's book, One Nation Under Blackmail. She's done a lot of work on this. But basically, Southern Air Transport was, after Iran-Contra, was converted into it was a cargo airline shipping arms, and then it was converted after it was sold into a commercial private jet line for Leslie Wexner and his retail company. And this is when Jeffrey Epstein was its power of attorney. And this is when Wexner basically signed over a bunch of his wealth suspiciously to Epstein. And this is when people believe that Epstein must have blackmailed Wexner, had something on him related to sexual, crimes of some sort. And that was also Epstein's sort of gateway into like the whole modeling world and all that. And actually, I mean, as I was saying, oddly enough, in one of our recent episodes on the CIA and drugs, we talked about the CIA's involvement in drug running in Central America and before that, Southeast Asia. And as I mentioned, Air America was the most well known in the CIA's secret war in Laos. And well, another one of those airlines was Southern Air Transport, which played a role in both the CIA's involvement in drug running in the Golden Triangle during Vietnam, and then later in Central America with the Contras. That proprietary organization, as I said, Epstein converted it into a private airline for Wexner, and he obtained his wealth likely through the sexual blackmail of Wexner, which is how he transitioned into being connected with modeling agencies and Trump. And people even speculate that Melania was sexually trafficked to Trump and all this stuff. I mean, I don't know if that's true, but it goes down a deep rabbit hole. But coincidentally, while all this is going on, I was reading this book, The CIA and the Cult of Intelligence, which, if you don't know, is written by Victor Marchetti and John D. Marks. And Victor Marchetti was one of the first big CIA whistleblowers, along with Phil Agee back in the 70s. And this book was subject to heavy censorship by the CIA before it was published because he was disclosing all kinds of dirty tricks that the CIA was involved in. But anyway, long story short, in this book, which is a classic, he talks about the inner workings of the CIA and how it operates. And Marchetti gets into how the CIA would get rid of its proprietary companies when their use value would run out. And that, like when it was done using a front company, it wouldn't just sell it to any ordinary person. It would sell it to somebody that had intelligence ties or was a company man, because, obviously the company has a sordid history that could implicate them. So they're not going to sell it to just anybody. And lo and behold, the example he gives in this book, this is written in 1974, so this is well before even Iran-Contra. The example he gives is Southern Air Transport. I mean, you can't make this shit up. Which was, at that time, it was, an airline that had been involved in drug smuggling in Indochina to bankroll the CIA's covert operations in Laos, that would later be involved in Iran-Contra, and then later would be involved in shipping lingerie for Leslie Wexner. So anyone out there trying to cast, but he specifically talks about how, the CIA would only get rid of its proprietary companies, like a Southern Air Transport, to people who had intelligence ties. So that alone should, apart from all the stuff that came out later about the sweetheart deal that Epstein got about, he was the attorney for Southern District of Florida or whatever was told to back off Acosta that because Epstein had ties to intelligence. You don't even have to look at that. I mean, this alone, the fact that he helped convert a former CIA front company into a commercial airline. I mean, that alone shows that he's connected to intelligence. So anyone like this creep Michael Tracy or any of these other people out there trying to cast out on Epstein's intelligence connections to me is just laughable. And also, of course, Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell, the British tabloid tycoon, he had significant connections to Mossad and is even buried on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem after he fell off his yacht. Go figure. So,
Well,
but anyway, yeah,
I just want to add that, yeah, and the CIA has a history of, well, for one thing, working with organized crime and then sort of employing organized crime type of tactics. I mean, even sexual blackmail. This isn't really the same as what Epstein was doing, but back in the 60s, when the US was beginning to attempt to overthrow Sukarno in Indonesia, the CIA got the ingenious idea to create a fake porno video of Sukarno with a Russian KGB agent. They even apparently used connections in Hollywood. They hired like a Mexican American actor to play Sukarno, but apparently the tape didn't turn out convincing enough, so they never ended up leaking it to the media. But
because they didn't have AI at the time. If they'd had AI back, they could have easily done that. Yeah, I mean, the CIA is not above doing stuff like that, and certainly not Mossad. I mean, sexual blackmail is a known tactic of the intelligence world, period. And, given the deep state, whatever you want to call its history of involvement in something like organized crime, terrorism, drug running, I mean, why would they not also be involved in sexual crimes of some sort? The ends justify the means, in that world, as far as like, there's an abstraction that's made between, and actually this book really talks a lot about it as far as operating the intelligence world. They're willing to do all the very things that they accuse their adversaries of doing because the ends justify the means, and there's no ethics or morals behind what they do. In fact, it's seen as a necessary evil, basically, to accomplish their goals. Um, so, no, it's very naive to not think that they wouldn't be capable of doing stuff like that, or that Epstein wasn't some kind of intelligence asset. I mean, if you just look at what he was doing, I mean, if you're involved in sex trafficking, a crime like sex trafficking, you typically do not have cameras in your house, and you typically do not. I mean, why is he only exclusively associating with the rich and the powerful and politicians and celebrities? I mean, this idea that we're supposed to believe that he somehow was exclusively associating with those people, but then also kept his sex trafficking completely separate from his social life. I mean, and that he was only trafficking to himself and Ghislaine Maxwell is just bizarre. I mean, so I don't understand people anyway. I mean, it's a very small minority, but there are some contrarian people out there who may or may not be compromised themselves, I suspect. So, but anyway, the reason that let's to get to our actual topic for the day. One of the most surprising revelations. I mean, Epstein was associated with a number of people, elite billionaires, other high-profile politicians in both political parties. Various celebrities were on his plane, models. But one of the most surprising revelations was regarding his association with Noam Chomsky. Brings us to our actual topic for the day because sadly, in the interim, the legendary political writer who is a huge influence on both of us here at Captive Minds, Michael Parenti, he died at the age of 92. And the timing of his death and these revelations about Chomsky and Epstein really set off a spirited debate online on the left and in the media about the legacy of these two intellectual giants on the left and sort of the contrast between them, and how someone like Noam Chomsky was, despite his criticism of American foreign policy or capitalism, uh, throughout his political career, was able to maintain a tenured position at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, while someone like Michael Parenti was never able to get tenure track and suffered serious consequences to his career and professionally because he took more uncompromising political stances and had more controversial views. So it just the timing of, I mean, the first initial revelations about Chomsky and Epstein actually came out a couple of years ago. And Chomsky, there have been a number of articles defending him. There was one in the Nation magazine by Greg Grandin, who's a historian on Latin America and stuff. There was an issue in Compact. I think it was Michael Tracy that wrote it defending Epstein. I mean, there have been some people defending him. And, Chomsky had his chance to get in front of his association with Epstein before he, became too senile or incapacitated to make public appearances anymore. He's still alive, but he's not speaking publicly anymore because of his age and frail condition. But he had his chance a few years ago, and he said it was none of our damn business. And people have given him the benefit of the doubt as far as not being implicated in any of the actual crimes. But these latest emails fully disclose how Chomsky not only knew about the accusations against Epstein, but was even offering him advice, telling him, I'm sorry that this is happening to you. He wrote him letters of recommendation. They had a financial relationship together. I think he was paying for his stay at a hotel. He was on his plane. I mean, again, people are still giving him the benefit of the doubt. There is no evidence that Chomsky actually
Well,
participated in anything. But his wife has since come out with a response, saying that they didn't really know, which is, you know, they said that, Chomsky wasn't aware. I mean, but at the time that Chomsky was associating with him, even Epstein's Wikipedia page listed his initial charges back in, I believe it was 2008, for prostitution of a minor, I believe it was. I mean, Chomsky was known to be such a prolific user of email. I knew people that emailed him and he would respond. So this idea that he was like an old man that didn't know how to use computers or something and couldn't Google.
well, I mean, Epstein's disturbed sexual exploits aside, why would a sensible radical pal around with some creepy billionaire in the first place?
The private island. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, no, it's, and also, he met with Ehud Barak. I mean, you could say, okay, well, maybe Chomsky was, as a prominent intellectual, trying to have some kind of positive impact on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. I don't really buy that because Barak wasn't prime minister anymore, and it's just the idea that he didn't know how to. Chomsky's very name is synonymous with meticulous research. This is a guy who can pull out obscure facts about historical stuff. He's a prolific researcher. The idea that he couldn't be bothered to find out, any details about this guy that he's associating with socially and financially, going to dinner with him and Woody and all this stuff. I mean, this is just ridiculous. So anyway, long story short, the timing of these revelations about Chomsky and the death of Parenti really set off a debate online about, the nature of being a left-wing academic and public figure, and how and careerism, and how the stances one takes affects one's position as far as like being able to be in institutions and suffering consequences professionally, whether your voice is going to be elevated or you're going to be marginalized. And I think it really sums up the differences between the two, because despite being a critic of U.S. foreign policy, Chomsky was, his job was never in jeopardy at MIT. I mean, he was first and foremost a linguist. His activism and his political writings were really secondary to his career as a linguist. But before we get more into that, I know, Shaenah, did you want to talk a little bit about how Chomsky's work at MIT as a linguist actually, and the paradox around how his research, I guess, was actually, I mean, MIT, for those who don't know, as a university, has a longstanding deep connection to the U.S. military. And I think that, yeah, you were going to talk about how his work actually had some connections to the U.S. military. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. But let me just note, I was just going over when I was preparing for this episode, I was just going over some more of things about the Chomsky Epstein connection, and I came upon, I think, my favorite email where Chomsky is telling Epstein about how the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela, it's not actually socialist, and
Yeah,
just
yeah.
the absurdity of him talking about this to Epstein is just very striking.
Well, he's flying on his plane. Yeah.
Anyways, yeah, Chomsky's work on theoretical linguistics that he did at MIT was funded by the Pentagon. I mean, even in the acknowledgments of his seminal 1957 work, Syntactic Structures, he writes, quote, "This work was supported in part by the USA Army, Signal Corps, the Air Force, Office of Scientific Research, Air Research and Development Command, and the Navy, Office of Naval Research, and in part by the National Science Foundation and the Eastman Kodak Corporation." Chomsky, I mean, he gained his fame really by his redefinition of linguistics that viewed the human brain as something sort of like a computer, with language being processed through a specialized language module in the brain. So Chomsky's theory that language could be boiled down to logical expressions was really groundbreaking for the emerging field of computer science and really dovetailed towards what the defense agencies needed at that time. As journalist Yasha Levine writes, quote, "His linguistic work at MIT in the 50s was funded by the Army, Navy, and Air Force, in large part because the military wanted to develop computer technology that could process human language on the fly in order to analyze intelligence intercepts and to process reports and understand human commands," close quote. And as an aside, Yasha Levine also wrote this really good book called Surveillance Valley about the military history of the internet, where he connects it to the Vietnam War and how the internet technology evolved for the need to collate the massive amount of data coming in from the Vietnam War and the US fighting the guerrilla forces there. But Chomsky was originally recruited to MIT apparently to conduct research for Pentagon scientist Jerome Weissner, who played a prominent part in setting up the US's entire nuclear missile program. And Weissner viewed Chomsky's type of linguistics as something that could eventually enhance nuclear missiles' command and control systems. And then similarly, in the early 60s, Lieutenant J. Keyser, who was later head of MIT's linguistics department, he also viewed Chomsky's work as possibly being useful in computerized missile and aircraft control of such things as B-58 nuclear-armed bombers. So as you can see, this really has a deep contradiction with Chomsky being a left-wing anti-war critic of the U.S. military. I mean, he also apparently the Mitri Corporation, which is an MIT offshoot, also employed Chomsky as a consultant for a project that meant to support, quote, "the development of U.S. Air Force supplied command and control systems." So basically, to sum up, his linguistic work that he was doing was really helpful in the field of nuclear missile control and the most detached, inhumane form of warfare imaginable.
Well, it's fascinating to hear that. I didn't know a lot of those details, but it almost kind of makes me wonder if his entire, sort of double life as a MIT linguist and as a left-wing polemicist. It's almost like the sort of, I don't know if it was motivated by guilt or sort of the paradox of being this figure entrenched in an institution like MIT, almost like he was making up for it by being a prominent figure on the left. I mean, it's an interesting psychological profile one could make because, you know, I mean, my understanding is that his linguistic career precedes his success as or becoming a prominent public figure on the political left. I mean, I know he was known because he when he was during the Vietnam Wars when he came to public attention for his politics, and he actually, I believe he refused to pay taxes. He was like involved in a protest that was organized around abstaining from paying taxes because in opposition to the Vietnam War, like a form of civil disobedience. And so, you know, he emerged out of the very much out of the new left in the 60s. And so I think, yeah, like psychologically, you could kind of see his double life doing, on the one hand, this career as a linguist, and then his political work on the other as sort of one in his mind canceling the other out. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I've seen people even say there are, quote, two Chomskys. But I think the whole situation with Epstein, it just, and some of his dubious political positions that he took, and he was entrenched, no, he was consistently anti-communist, and I think that you can't disconnect his positions on foreign policy, like what he said about Yugoslavia, from his
Yeah.
work as an MIT linguist, basically doing work for the US military.
Yeah, there's definitely a connection there. And I think anyone trying to separate the two is an apologist. And, you know, that's really why we wanted to do this topic, because the timing of the death of Parenti and these revelations about Chomsky is really perfect because I think it really puts things in perspective and sums up the sort of general divide on the left between what Gabriel Rockhill calls the compatible left and represented by someone like Chomsky, and the anti-imperialist, dialectical, historical, materialist, Marxist left, represented by someone like Michael Parenti. And it also exemplifies how, if you're going to be a public figure or academic and you take certain uncompromising political stances, you're going to be rejected by the ruling establishment and institutions like Parenti. And on the flip side, Chomsky, he really epitomizes someone who, while yes, a very prominent critic, if not the most prominent critic of U.S. foreign policy on the American left, he was also took these stances that were, for example, yeah, very critical of the Soviet Union, and as far as like his critiques of foreign policy, he would always, yes, denounce U.S. militarism on the one hand, but then he would turn around and repeat a lot of the talking points used to demonize countries in the global South targeted for regime change. And we talked on this podcast before about the Congress for Cultural Freedom, how during the Cold War, the CIA covertly tried to mold and shape the left into one that was, yes, critical of capitalism and Western imperialism, but was also simultaneously critical, if not more so, of the USSR and the anti-imperialist bloc. I mean, Chomsky himself identified as an anarcho-syndicalist or a libertarian socialist.
Speaking of this, the CIA, though, I dug up something. Apparently, in various interviews, Chomsky had described John Deutsch, an MIT scientist who worked on the Pentagon's nuclear and chemical weapons strategy, then Deputy Defense Secretary, and then Director of the
I
CIA.
was going to say, is that the same CIA?
Yes,
Yeah.
he described him as a friend of his who, quote, has more honesty and integrity than anyone I've ever met in academic life or any other life. If someone's got to be running the CIA, I'm glad it's him, close
Well,
quote.
that's the same guy who, on the previous episode, on CIA and drugs, when I played that clip of the town hall in
Yeah.
LA of people confronting, of what's his name? Michael C. Rupert, the former LAPD narcotics detective, confronting the CIA director about whether the agency was running drugs. That's John Deutsch, the guy who's responding to him. So yeah, no, I think that he had a lot of irreconcilable contradictions in his professional and personal life. And there's definitely a connection there. And I think, like I said, Chomsky emerged during the 60s from the left that sort of inherited the legacy of what the Congress for Cultural Freedom was trying to create, really, with the compatible left. And he kind of took up that mantle. And like I said, he famously refused to pay taxes during the Vietnam War to protest U.S. involvement as an act of civil disobedience. And he signed a tax pledge. And he had, of course, become known as a famous linguist, but was politically active in his personal life. And he was seldomly invited on mainstream media. That's on the one hand true, though he did get, sometimes he would do op-eds in the New York Times and stuff. But by the 80s, he was very well known, lecturing on college campuses across America. There's a famous debate between him and Michel Foucault that took place on TV that people can watch online. That's pretty fascinating. But he basically became one of the faces of the American left. And, he did highlight U.S. war crimes and I mean, I'm talking about him in the past tense. He's still alive, but he's no longer giving public appearances, and probably will die soon. He's very old. But he did highlight U.S. war crimes in South America, and Israeli crimes against the Palestinians. And actually, when I was first getting into radical politics myself, in my late teens, which was after 9/11 and during the Iraq War, that was when I first encountered Chomsky and, people like Howard Zinn. And I read James W. Lowen's Lies My Teacher Told Me. That was some of the first, entry level, like radical left stuff that I encountered. And I read Manufacturing Consent. And it had a very big impact on me as far as like a critic being a scathing critique. I mean, it's a classic of the political economy of the mass media and how propaganda works. And it was a great stepping stone to people like Parenti. And actually, but the thing is, a lot of people don't know is that, first of all, Manufacturing Consent, despite it's synonymous with Chomsky, but actually the majority of it was written by Edward S. Herman, who was I mean, the book even says written by Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky. But Chomsky got all the accolades or all the attention. I mean, he even himself said that it was mostly written by Herman. I think Herman came up with the propaganda model that's in it, and he wrote the first 4 chapters. I think Chomsky only wrote the latter 3. But even so, that book was preceded by this book, which is very, very similar, by Michael Parenti, Inventing Reality, Politics of the Mass Media. Now, had Herman and Chomsky read this, I don't know. I mean, it's possible with how long it takes for books to come out that they may have been written simultaneously. I'm not sure. I mean, whichever one came first. I mean, that Parenti's book did come out first. But nevertheless, Chomsky was a great stepping stone to better, more radical thinkers like Parenti. And I tell this story all the time, but it's funny. Like this was like during my punk rock phase. I mean, which I'm still basically in, really. But the way I actually discovered Parenti was someone had loaned me a copy of an album by this group, Choking Victim, who later became known as Leftover Crack. But anyway, they were this, ska punk band with radically political lyrics and stuff. And they had a bunch of samples of Parenti talking, like on the intros of their songs. And so I was like, who is this guy talking? Like, this is really profound. And I was just instantly, as soon as I discovered who it was, I read everything I could get my hands on by him and became a big fan.
It's funny. I've heard that before about how Chomsky was a stepping stone. I've never actually read him. I did read Howard Zinn and Lies My Teachers Told Me were definitely stepping stones for me. But I started right off with Parenti. And then it was a stepping stone to Lacerdo. So,
Yeah, I mean, I will say that Manufacturing Consent is a great book. I mean, Chomsky did do a lot of good work. It's just that it always had, he would always include his other views, particularly in his lectures. And Manufacturing Consent, I mean, a lot of what it says, I mean, really is covered by Parenti and Inventing Reality and probably better. But the thing is that Chomsky's co-author, Ed Herman, who wrote, I think, three other books with him, like I said, he was the one that came up with the propaganda model. And actually, by the 90s, you mentioned the war in Yugoslavia earlier, because that's sort of when Chomsky and Parenti really kind of became rivals, so to speak, because they took, although they were both opposed to NATO's involvement, I mean, Parenti and actually Edward S. Herman were two of the people that took much more hardline positions as far as like disputing a lot of the propaganda that came out to justify NATO's intervention in that war, as far as like singling out the Serbs for ethnic cleansing and war crimes that was used to justify NATO intervening in that conflict. And, I think that this is kind of where Chomsky's sort of problematic politics really become apparent because, he was critical of the NATO intervention as far as like bombing Yugoslavia and whatnot, but he was not willing to, there was like a committee to defend Milosevic, who was, the US government was saying that what the Serbs in Bosnia were doing was being ordered from Belgrade and that the Serbian government needed to be targeted, even though there was absolutely no evidence of that. I mean, and then also, first and foremost, what was taking place there was, as people like Herman and Parenti wrote about, that it was a civil war. It was ethnic cleansing happening on every side. It wasn't just the Serbs that were committing the most atrocities. And Chomsky wouldn't challenge that. He would just only say that that we needed to oppose the NATO intervention on moral grounds. And actually, I've seen interviews with him about it, and he was always invoking the fact that, like, for example, he would say that, well, Turkey is killing just as many Kurds. So therefore, Turkey is a member of NATO and a U.S. ally. So why aren't we intervening against Turkey? And it's like, okay, well, yes, that's true, but he still was basically it's saying that what they're saying is true. He's not disputing any of the propaganda or that what happened at Srebrenica was being greatly exaggerated and inflated. And my personal theory about this is the reason that Chomsky was not willing to do that, like even his own co-author, Ed Herman, is because back in the 1970s, when the Khmer Rouge took power in Cambodia, Noam Chomsky very controversially defended the Khmer Rouge when all these reports were coming out about them committing mass killings, the killing fields. If you haven't seen John Pilger's documentary, Year Zero, I'd recommend that. I mean, they were notoriously racist and, they were, what they were trying to carve out was, they were wiping out people who were intellectuals and had any sort of education. I mean, it was a total bastardization of Marxism as far as I'm concerned. And not only that, they were also covertly supported by the CIA. John Pilger wrote about that as well. But anyway,
Chomsky endorses the Khmer Rouge, yet denounces the Bolivarian Revolution to Epstein and constantly denounces the Soviet Union. It's
yeah, I mean,
very
he was
upside
so quick
down.
he was so quick to defend the Khmer Rouge. I mean, now granted, he never apologized for it, but also the reasons he gave for it were, that the U.S. media's reports were unreliable. They constantly make up things about countries, and that we have no idea these death tolls that they're giving are probably being inflated because it's a communist government. That's actually accurate. That does happen all the time. But unfortunately, what was going on in Cambodia was actually arguably a genocide. I mean, genocide is a politicized term. it gets thrown around very casually. Obviously, what Israel's doing in Gaza amounts to a genocide. But, what the Khmer Rouge were doing was, I mean, they were genociding their own people, but, it was, if it does apply, I mean, they were committing mass atrocities. Whether or not they were inflated or not is a whole other question. But nevertheless, my theory is, okay, so Chomsky did that and it got him into a lot of hot water. It was very controversial. He was heavily criticized for it. It dogged him his whole career. So flash forward to the 90s.
Wait, let
And
me add, sorry for interrupting. I just, before I
okay.
forget, when I add one more thing about the Khmer Rouge, if I remember correctly, the Vietnamese communists ended up backing a force to get rid of the Khmer Rouge and then sponsored like a new president of the country, which the US refused to help
Yeah, I mean,
against the
the US
Khmer Rouge.
openly, I mean, I think Pol Pot got safe harbor in Thailand, and the US I mean, by the 80s, I mean, people try and dispute whether they covertly supported the Khmer Rouge, but it's very, very clear that the CIA supported them. I mean, yes, Chomsky was right to say that the US bombing of Cambodia killed hundreds of thousands of people, and the whole reason that they took power in the first place was because of that. But no, by the 80s, the US, I mean, the Vietnamese were who intervened to stop that genocide. And by the 80s, the US was openly backing the Khmer Rouge against the Vietnamese in that war. So anyway, but so like I was saying, fast forward to the 90s, the word genocide is being thrown around accusing the Serbs. And here's an actual instance where Chomsky could have taken a stance where death tolls like at Srebrenica were being greatly inflated, and there was this political framing and propaganda demonizing one side and absolving like the Croats and the Kosovar Albanians and the Bosnian Mujahideen and whatnot. And he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't take that political stance where it actually applied. So I think that says a lot about him, and I think it's mainly because he may have even known that, but I don't. I think he realized that when he defended the Khmer Rouge and he got into hot water over it, he realized that his position at MIT could be in jeopardy. He could be fired. He could lose his tenure track position.
And that
His co-author and Parenti and so on, and Diana Johnstone and other people who were willing to.
I think that's really illustrative of one of the main differences I think between Parenti and Chomsky is a matter of seemingly personal integrity, whereas Parenti wasn't afraid to take positions that would get him in hot water and obviously, made him sort of an outsider in the academic establishment. Chomsky would never fully really cross the line
Yeah, I
where it
wanted to.
would jeopardize his career. And you were speaking about your first encounter with Parenti. I think my first was, I think, my mom shared with me his lecture about conspiracy, where he
Yeah.
talks about how it is in the ruling class's interests to conspire to advance their interests.
Well, yeah, that's one of the areas where he and Chomsky really clash was because
Yeah.
Chomsky was a huge critic of there's like a famous clip of him being confronted about the Kennedy assassination. And he's basically saying, why does it matter who killed Kennedy? People die all the time. I mean, he had a real contempt and complete, lack of, I mean, he only wanted, like Parenti talked about, he saw a conflict between the structural and the functional, that we only need to make structural critiques, that there's no functional critique to be made as far as how the ruling class actually, through a, clandestine state within a state, shadow government, whatever you want to call it, because we do ostensibly live in a democracy. The American people don't actually want this stuff that the US government is doing abroad. They have to be lied to about it, which Chomsky wrote about. But at the same time, not only do they have to be propagandized, they have to do things that they don't even know about, especially when a certain US president may have gotten out of line as far as like refusing to carry out the orders that he was given, and that it's not really him that's in charge. But yeah, Chomsky had notoriously had contempt for people wanting to find out the truth about the Kennedy assassination and also 9/11 and other stuff. I mean, he was just one of these people, and that's also why his position at MIT was never threatened, because if he were to do that, he certainly would be not in good graces with the establishment. But I wanted to play this clip. This is I mean, I think there's several instances where he called him out, but this is one in Parenti's lecture on Yugoslavia where he,
Yeah, I must say, Parenti, he really, aside from being a great writer and being able to communicate complex and deep ideas in a simple way that anyone could understand, he also was a great public speaker who would use intersperse humor and anecdotes to really enrich his lectures and make them enjoyable to listen to.
yeah, and humor. I mean, Chomsky had no sense of humor whatsoever. I mean, there's a hilarious clip of him. I mean, I'm not a big Sacha Baron Cohen fan, but there's a hilarious clip of him on, getting pranked on the Ali G show. And Chomsky has absolutely no sense of humor. He has no idea he's being pranked. I mean, Donald Trump was able to tell that Ali G was full of shit and was being pranked, but Noam Chomsky couldn't pick up on it. But anyway, this is Michael Parenti talking about the demonization specifically of Milosevic, Slobodan Milosevic, the Serbian leader, in his lecture U.S. War in Yugoslavia, and where he calls out Chomsky.
Yugoslavia, before the NATO bombings, before this war began, before that, in Yugoslavia, every opposition newspaper, every opposition political party had its own newspaper, its own radio station, and there were over 20 of them. Milosevic today has more opposition parties in his parliament than any other leader in Europe. Of course, since the NATO bombings, they've shut down all the newspapers, they've shut down their radio stations, as we had happen in this country with German stations and things like that in World War I, if you remember, and we weren't even being bombed or attacked. Milosevic has been elected president 3 times, twice of the Republic of Serbia, once of the Yugoslav Republic, or what's left of it now, in elections which foreign observers said were pretty much okay and legitimate. Yet he has been called a dictator. He is called a war criminal. The Hague War Crimes Tribunal has asked the United States for documentation of the war crimes that he has committed so that they may indict him as a war criminal. So far, it's been over a year. No documentation has been forthcoming. Will you please tell me, Noam Chomsky called him the monstrous Milosevic, gave no specifics. Could someone start giving me some specifics about it?
Anyway, so yeah, there are numerous times in that lecture where he calls him out, but yeah, it's they did develop a kind of rivalry to some extent, and Christian Parenti has been making the rounds on podcasts and stuff since his dad died, talking about that and how the timing of his dad's death, and then these revelations about Chomsky kind of like has set the record straight as far as who was better, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, no, if Parenti had been in the Epstein files, I would have been really, really surprised.
No, I mean, yeah, it's just that would never happen. And I think
No.
trying to deny that there's a connection there, I think is naive. And I think at a certain point in his career, Chomsky made a careerist decision that he had to be careful about not going too far. Otherwise, his position at
Yeah,
MIT would be in jeopardy.
I think it goes to show as much as people can compartmentalize themselves, your two spheres of activity end up seeping into each other, no matter how much, say, he'd try to keep his linguistic career for the US military separate from his politics.
Yeah, I mean, there are numerous, even more recent examples of where Chomsky really towed the line. I mean, a good example is the Syrian war and the Kurdish question. Like in Trump's first term, he briefly, withdrew support for the Kurds and as a result, they were getting attacked by the Turkish-backed militias in Syria, the Islamist militias. And for those who don't know, the Kurds, they have their enclave there in northeastern Syria. And on their territory, they have U.S. military bases because they basically been rebranded into an organization called the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are the U.S.-backed forces led by the Kurds who are fighting ISIS. And the Kurds have basically been turned into a strategic asset because of their location. If you don't know, they live basically at the intersection of four countries: Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. And they also happen to sit on a big plot of oil. And, they've basically, while they've been used by the U.S. as this strategic asset, they've basically been facilitating the theft of Syria's oil. And so anyway, and also, if you're not aware, the Kurds, their local governorate is, its politics are one of this very left-wing, at least ostensibly, it's not really, but they've been given a very progressive veneer as far as having very egalitarian policies towards women's rights. It's basically their government is like democratic confederalist. They're very, it's basically, it purports to be an autonomous zone and a commune, basically, a feminist utopia. They've been
Yes.
given the whole.
Slavoj Žižek wrote some essay about how the Kurdish utopian enclave or something to that effect a while ago.
And
Like,
they've been championed by all kinds of people on the pseudo left. I mean, to me, it's really problematic because, first of all, it's kind of similar to Israel, or like the kibbutz, where they have this ostensibly socialist structure to their local governance, but then it's exclusively for one ethnic minority when they're not the only ethnic group in the region, and they've actually expelled other ethnic groups from their enclave. It's also been a big problem, like, for example, in the Syrian war, because the Kurds in Turkey have been at war with the Turkish government for like 40 years. They have what's called the Kurdistan Workers' Party. And their whole political philosophy comes from this guy who leads the Kurdistan Workers' Party. His name is Abdullah Öcalan. He's been in prison since the 90s. And he's, basically a anarcho-syndicalist, libertarian socialist, the same political philosophy that Chomsky espouses. And Öcalan was actually very influenced by Murray Bookchin, who also, it's so funny, Murray Bookchin was an American social critic, and also a ecologist and stuff. And his ideas really influenced the Kurdish freedom movement, particularly Abdullah Öcalan and the PKK, and actually convinced them to shift they were originally like more Marxist communists, and he actually convinced them to shift their ideology to this democratic confederalism. And his whole ideas about social ecology, anti-statism, libertarian municipalism. Bookchin's ideas basically laid the basis for the whole self-governance and gender equality and ecologically friendly communes that they have in Rojava in northeastern Syria, the ethnic enclave. But it's been a big problem for the U.S.-Turkey alliance which is why they rebranded the Kurds in Syria as the SDF, because if they have ties to the Kurdistan Workers' Party in Turkey, that's a big problem because the U.S. is basically supporting an organization that Turkey considers a terrorist organization. So they just have taken them, rebranded them as the SDF, and are using them as this proxy army to fight ISIS and basically to instead of having the Kurds align with Assad and the Syrian government, they have this, basically they're trying to balkanize Syria and they're using the Kurds to do it. And there's this paradox where they're, supporting this nominally socialist group, and they're letting the U.S. military colonize, steal Syria's resources And so anyway, long story short, when Trump temporarily withdrew support for the Kurds and people were up in arms, Chomsky came out and said, "Oh no, we need to support the US troops supporting we need to keep the US troops in Syria to support the Kurds," is what he said. So that's all you have to do to get these people to like Chomsky to support US imperialism is just give it this progressive veneer. All of it's all about women's rights in the Middle East. And
Yeah, we're really freeing those Iranian women now by killing girls in school and stuff,
well, and of course
saving them.
the biggest problem with this kind of amateurish politics is what happened as soon as Assad fell. The US stopped supporting the Kurds again, and now they're being killed by, this Islamist thug that's in power, Jelani, and his, rebranded Al Qaeda people.
Yeah, because the US's support for the Kurds isn't genuine support. It's recognizing they can be used as a wedge into the region, and when they cease to be useful, they will be discarded.
Exactly. And it's really sad too, because I mean, I definitely feel for the Kurds. I mean, there are 40 million people without a state or something like that. I'm not sure what the actual, that might be too many, but it's definitely in the millions and they don't have a state. They live at the intersection of four different countries. This is not their fault. But the problem is that, they've also been supported by Israel because Israel, their whole Greater Israel project, they want to come out and they want to balkanize the Middle East and Syria, and so they it's a strategic asset for them as well. But you can't tell this to Western leftist people and mainstream left people like Chomsky because they really fetishize the Kurds, and they don't want to support the Syrian government, against what is essentially an American proxy war for Syria's resources. No, they threw their support behind the Kurds because they have these political ideals, and they have these communes in Afrin and Rojava and this libertarian socialist project that's made possible by the U.S. military. It really exemplifies like the amateurishness of his political positions. And it's interesting because Chomsky in his youth, I think in the 50s, he spent several months on kibbutz in Israel. And if you look at what the Kurds are doing, I mean, it's not really that much different than what Israel, like when it started, was the sort of rebranding that it was given, even though it was this project of colonization and ethno-nationalism and ethnic supremacy. It was, well, it's egalitarian, it's about farming and communal living and all that. It's just that it also excluded but it's very similar. And Chomsky was certainly anti-Zionist in many respects, but I think also I suspect in some respects he was kind of like a liberal Zionist. And I mean, he was Jewish, and his family background was a left wing background. I don't know. Maybe his parents were. I mean, I've written about it, the whole relationship between Israel or the Zionist project initially, and how it really fooled a lot of the left and the socialist world, including the USSR itself. Unfortunately, went along with it in the beginning. But I think that ties into Chomsky's politics as well. And certainly, there's a question surrounding how his relationship with Epstein impacted his views on Israel because weirdly, despite being a lifelong critic of Israel, Chomsky wouldn't support the BDS movement. I mean, it was just very bizarre. I mean, why would he not support that? I mean, even apart from all the other critical things I have to say to him, he was consistent his entire life in terms of being very, very critical of Israel. And it's just bizarre that he had this relationship with Epstein because it's like, I mean, I remember back in the day watching on C-SPAN, like Chomsky had heated public debates with Alan Dershowitz about Israel. And I watched several of them, and Chomsky really obliterated him. But yet here he is associating with Epstein, and Dershowitz is Epstein's lawyer. Like, what are you even doing hanging out with this guy? That should have been a red flag alone. So yeah, there's a lot of questions about, I'm not satisfied with what his wife had to say. But all this, I mean, you were talking about, I mean, it's a legitimate question whether his relationship with Epstein had an effect on his BDS stance and numerous other positions he took. But you were mentioning like Chomsky and the Soviet Union. I mean, I wanted to play a clip of him that I found where this is sort of, I guess in this talk, he was giving a talk and he gets asked a question by this woman who's like, I think she's from the Spartacist League or she's a Trotskyist or something. And she's
Yeah.
asking about why he opposed the Soviet Union and communism. But what were you going to say?
Oh, I was gonna say, yeah, one of my favorite memes that I've seen recently is it's the picture of Chomsky and Epstein's private jet, and he's telling something to Epstein, and he's like, "So I was telling you about how the Bolsheviks are evil statists, or something to that effect.
It's who
Betrayed the
betrayed the working
revolution."
class while he's sitting on
Yes,
Epstein's private plane.
that
Yeah,
was the
I mean,
other thing. Wasn't there some email from Epstein to Chomsky talking about IQ tests and race?
well, yeah, I mean, Chomsky was
That
disagreeing with them, obviously, but like that alone, I
that
mean,
was strange.
yeah, like, I mean, look, there's people that have defended Chomsky saying, well, Epstein was, I mean, because it's true, he was courting all kinds of academics, particularly in the sciences. I mean,
He tried to get Roman Finkelstein, I thought, but
yeah, who threatened to strangle him, that's the only appropriate response to have to this creep billionaire pedophile with a private island trying to get you to go out
who
to dinner with him.
who also had an interest in eugenics and preserving his own
Eating the human
seed.
race with
And
his
yes,
DNA.
yes.
Yeah, I mean, look, he Epstein had a relationship with Leon Botstein, the head of Bard, and numerous other people in colleges. I mean, it's this revolving door between academia and, I mean, again, it's like George Carlin said, it's a big club and you ain't in it. It's an elite cabal. These people all
Well,
go to the same country club.
as
Chomsky was in those circles. I mean, he might have been uncomfortable. He might have been not fully in it, but he was in it. And I'm sorry, it's related to his politics to some degree.
well, as Rockwell does a good job pointing out, the universities and academia is intimately connected to ruling class foundations and to the state, the CIA, and intelligence.
And has been for decades. I mean, the CIA recruits from Ivy League schools and big institutions. I mean,
Yes.
it's a revolving door between Imperium and these big institutions. And as far as like there's an inherent anti-communism to Chomsky's politics, I think that really is exemplified by this clip, which is again, I think it's a woman, some Trotskyist woman in the audience confronting him, and I mean, he was always a jerk to people in the audience. I mean, it wasn't a very good question, but I think his response kind of sums up the anti-communist views that are really at the heart of his politics.
Now, as far as the Soviet Union is concerned, I didn't happen to talk about it tonight, but I've written about this topic. I haven't just made the charge. I've written about it and explained why I think it's true. And it doesn't bother me if I happen to agree with the mainstream media on this. Trotsky, to pick somebody who you remember, once he was charged in the 1930s with agreeing with the fascists in his condemnation of the Soviet Union. And he pointed out that his critique was to be true. He wasn't going to abandon it if somebody else happened to say it for different reasons. So the question is about the Soviet Union, and particularly about Lenin. So what was Leninism? Well, here we have to look at the facts. Now, you look at the facts, I think here's what you find. Lenin was a right-wing deviation of the socialist movement, and he was so regarded. He was regarded as that by the Marxists, by the mainstream Marxists. We've forgotten who the mainstream Marxists were because they lost, and you only remember the guys who won. But if you go back to that period, the mainstream Marxists were people like, for example, Anton Pannekoek, who was head of education for the Marxist movement, and he's one of the people who Lenin later denounced as an infantile leftist. But he was one of the leading intellectuals of the actual Marxist movement. Rosa Luxemburg was another mainstream Marxist, and there were others. And they were very critical. In fact, Trotsky was one up until 1917. They were all very critical of Leninism because of this, what they regarded as this opportunistic vanguardism. The idea that
was a Leninist.
against you, we're going to
Ostensibly.
exploit popular movements to seize state power and then to use that state power to whip the population into the society that they chose. Now, that was quite inconsistent with Marxism as understood by the mainstream sort of, I'd say, left Marxists. From this point of view, Bolshevism was a right-wing deviation. Trotsky made the same points up till 1970.
So basically everything he just said is almost completely false. Like it's just a complete I don't even know where to begin with that clip, but it really does sum up like sort of first of all, he's talking to the audience like they're stupid. Like, for example, like when he invokes this very obscure socialist figure.
Anton Pannekoek
Pannekoek
wasn't a mainstream Marxist at all. He was very obscure and
Yeah, he knows that no one in the audience knows who that is, including the person who's asked the question. I mean, Anton Pannekoek, I don't know much about him. I just know that he was a Dutch, like council communist. But even if you, like Chomsky, agree with that kind of Marxism, the idea that he was mainstream or like somehow represented the mainstream socialist movement at that time is completely false. That was a very obscure, not well-known figure. So he's not being truthful about that. I mean, he's really playing a kind of game here. I mean,
well, he was also kind of making it seem like Trotsky and Lenin were opposed.
well, and Rosa Luxemburg too.
Trotsky ostensibly was a Leninist, and that's the whole claim that he really followed in the tradition of Lenin and Stalin deviated. That was sort of the whole claim Trotsky tried to make.
Well, but I mean, first and foremost, he claims that Trotsky was accused of collaborating with the fascists with fascism because he happened to share criticism of the Soviet Union. But that's not true. Trotsky was accused of collaborating with fascism, if you look at the historical record, because he opposed the Popular Front strategy. He condemned having a united front against fascism. I mean, at the time, I mean, whether you agree with it in hindsight or not, the Comintern was trying to forge an alliance with liberals, with Roosevelt, with social democrats to stop the rise of Nazism. When the Nazis invaded France, Trotsky opposed forming any kind of alliance with de Gaulle and like the bourgeois forces because it was class collaborationism.
A perfect example of how Trotsky and then his followers are actually the dogmatic ones.
Yeah, I mean, they were undermining the Popular Front strategy from a revolutionary defeatist position, meaning that one should root for the defeat of their own government under capitalism, which is what the Bolsheviks advocated under the Tsar, not during the rise of fascism, not under the global threat of fascism, which is a distinct historical circumstance. And then, Trotsky had the gall to say that the Popular Front strategy was class collaborationism. Meanwhile, he was willing to appear before the Dies Committee, which was part of the House on Un-American Activities Committee, and a committee to investigate Roosevelt ties to communism. It was basically the early incarnation of the House on Un-American Activities Committee in the late 30s to the mid 40s. It was chaired by this Texas Congressman Martin Dies, and it was established to investigate, disloyalty and subversion and propaganda from both communists and fascists and other un-American groups. And they were targeting the New Deal programs and labor unions and organizations like the Federal Theater Project and the Federal Works Project that happened under Roosevelt. Trotsky agreed to testify before it on the crimes of the USSR and the Soviet secret police. The only reason he didn't get to is because the State Department wouldn't approve his visa. That's my understanding. But so there was a good reason he was accused of being a fascist collaborator. It went way beyond, just simply happening to critique the USSR and fascism. I mean, he was going to get up before a session of Congress investigating Roosevelt for ties to communists. I mean, and collaborating with Stalinism. I mean, it's just, but then on top of that, to say that Lenin and the Bolsheviks were a right-wing deviation of socialism by mainstream Marxists, even if you don't agree with Leninism, he's misrepresenting what the mainstream was at the time, as we discussed on a previous podcast. Many of the social democratic parties in Europe, the Second International, who were the mainstream Marxists, the Bolsheviks were in the minority. They had broken the promise they'd made to oppose World War I and supported it. And people like Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and then Luxembourg and Leibniz in Germany, and here in the US, Eugene Debs went to prison for opposing the war. They were considered the left-wing deviation, not right-wing. This is just flat out false. And people like Karl Kautsky were the mainstream, who sold out the working class in support of the war. And of course, but Chomsky, when he's representing this history, he name drops a very obscure figure, this Dutch council communist, Anton Pannekoek, who was not prominent or mainstream. Chomsky likes his politics and agrees with him, but it's just false that this was like somehow the mainstream view. The mainstream view was people like Kautsky. The German Social Democrats were the biggest socialist party in Europe at the time. And Rosa Luxemburg also was not a mainstream Marxist. Yes, she did, as Chomsky was saying, criticize like the one-party rule of the Bolsheviks and vanguardism to an extent, and was at odds with Lenin on things like whether Ukraine had the right to become a state. But she was not divided with Lenin on the question of imperialist war, and they were considered allies. And in fact, she was kicked out of the German Social Democratic Party by the mainstream Marxists that were actually mainstream at the time, and was killed by them in the Spartacus uprising. The German Social Democrats who used the Freikorps, so they were the actual fascist collaborators. So Chomsky is just completely fabricating history. I mean, the Third International was founded by Lenin. The Comintern was founded by Lenin after Luxemburg's murder. So he's just, and also Trotsky, he was part of, it's true that he was a mainstream, he is right, Chomsky is right to say that Trotsky was a mainstream Marxist to some extent, in that he was a Menshevik, or he would call himself a non-factional social democrat. I think he was part of what was called the Mezhraioncy, or it was like he straddled the fence basically, and had this intermediate ideological position up until right before the revolution, when he opportunistically joined it at the last minute. And he and Lenin were at odds as far as like, the issue of whether there should be an alliance between the peasantry and the workers. I mean, he thought the peasantry were an inherently reactionary class. But so Lenin was to the left of Trotsky. This idea that the Bolsheviks were this right-wing deviation. I mean, I could go on and play the rest of the clip, but basically Chomsky goes on to talk about like how the Bolsheviks eradicated, they basically shut down well, let me just play a little bit more of the clip if you don't mind.
In April 1917, he took a different line, quite a different line from the one he'd had in the past. You take a look at Lenin's work, it shifted character in April 17. In April 1917, it became kind of libertarian. That's when he came out with the April Theses, and that's when he wrote State and Democracy. It came out a year later, but that's when it was written. And these were State and Revolution. These were basically libertarian works. They were very much more in the mainstream of sort of left libertarian socialism from sort of, this range that goes from anarchism over to left Marxism of the Pannekoek-Luxemburg variety. And he talked about Soviets and the need for, a workers' organization and so on. And in fact, came really closer to what the essence of socialism was always understood to be. After all, the core of socialism was understood to be workers' control over production. That was the core. That's where you begin with. Then you go on to other things. But the beginning is control by the workers over production. That's where it begins. Then Lenin took power in October 1917 in what's called a revolution, but in my view ought to be called a coup. And then things followed that coup, or revolution, if you want to call it. One of the things that followed it was the immediate moves to destroy the Soviets and the factory councils. Those were some of the first moves of Lenin and Trotsky after Trotsky joined at that point, after they took state power. In fact, if you look at what Lenin wrote after that period, or did, you'll find it's a reversion to the earlier position. This sort of left deviation is a deviation. You could ask why. In my view, it was just opportunistic. He knew that in order to gain power, he was going to have to go along with the popular currents that were developing, which were in fact spontaneous and libertarian and socialist, as most popular movements have been, in fact, since the 17th century. And being an astute politician, which he was, he sort of went along with that and talked the line that the people wanted to hear. It's just like when an American politician goes somewhere and his pollsters tell him, say so-and-so, and he says it, meaning believes it. And I think Lenin was doing the same thing without polls. In any event, whatever your interpretation is, when he took power, he reverted to the former vanguardism and moved at once to eliminate the organs of workers' control. Now, that meant he was moving to destroy socialism, if socialism has as its core workers' control over production.
So, I mean, again,
he's totally just giving the mainstream media line with the whole thing that it's a coup and all that, but with this radical gloss over it, mentioning these obscure communist figures.
And he's talking about how socialism is just workers controlling production, which is not. That's the huge oversimplification, because it's not just about workers controlling production. It's about seizing the means of production and also changing the nature of it so that it's not purely for profit. And it's not just about creating these localized, communes where like people live together on a farm and share everything, like these workers cooperatives, it's just completely false. I mean, he goes on in the same lecture to talk about how criticizing the fact that the Soviets, that they basically just, in his opinion, reconstituted the Tsarist secret police in the form of the Cheka or the
he's also
KGB.
totally.
Parenti is great on that subject, how states targeted for imperialism have to have a secret police, even though it was the KGB was totally distinct from the Okhrana. It's not the same entity.
Well, because as other people have noted, the USSR was the development of socialism under siege. It was in a very hostile global situation. It wasn't just this, let's just have our happy workers' communes and we'll be on our way. Even right away from its very inception, the USSR was invaded by an alliance of countries, and there was a massive bloody civil war, and
he's not addressing. He's basically taking the line that that was the basis for the Kronstadt rebellion. But what the Kronstadt sailors wanted was not realistic at the time. And also what he's saying about, it being a coup, is just completely false, because the month before the revolution, there was an actual coup attempt by a general. It's called the Kornilov affair. He was a general. He wasn't a monarchist, but he was a general who tried to impose a military dictatorship in September. And the Bolsheviks actually were the forces that were the most organized that were able to prevent such a thing. It wasn't the provisional government that would have been able to stop that. And that's actually part of the reason that the Bolsheviks were able to take power, because they were the most organized. They had the military, and they were actually able to prevent a coup. And he's going with basically this bourgeois liberal line that like, well, because they weren't elected, it was a coup. And, Lenin, that's actually that's basically what Kautsky argued. And Lenin responded to that in the Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, where he's talking about how Kautsky is defending bourgeois democracy, which is an inherently violent system, was the very system that sent millions of workers to die in World War I to begin with, and defended their right to have a revolution. And Lenin was not writing from any right-wing perspective, but just the opposite. But, Trotsky is taking the line that the workers' opposition and the Kronstadt uprising, which basically the anarchist position that opposes having any central authority, any central party, argued for having workers' councils without communists, which is, of course, the reason it was crushed was because of this threat to what they were doing overall. You can't have that kind of thing in the middle of a civil war and over a dozen countries invading you. What the Kronstadt sailors wanted was completely absurd and not realistic. He's basically making a new left critique of the USSR, and
Yeah, and
I think he doesn't understand the nature of, it's not just about seizing the means of production. It's about for these like localized democratic communes. It's about seizing the means of production and having it serve society at large, not for profit. It's about freeing the means of production from, the irrationality and anarchy of production purely for profit. I mean, there's an inherent contradiction in the whole idea of libertarian socialism. I was actually arguing with somebody online that claimed that Chomsky does not identify as a libertarian socialist, but as a anarcho-syndicalist, which is completely false. If you, on his own website, there's interviews with him talking about his whole concept of libertarian socialism. It's a paradoxical, to me, it's just as paradoxical as anarcho-capitalists. It's the same. You have to have the state to do these things, to reorganize society. I mean, anarchists talk about the withering away of the state, or that's what Lenin talked about, was eventually the withering away of the state. But first, you have to use the state to achieve, and you have to have a dictatorship of the proletariat. And this whole jumping to just having, this anti-statist, utopian living off the grid. I mean, these kinds of forces have been undermining. I mean, they were detrimental to, and were part of the reason that Franco seized power in Spain in the Spanish Civil War. They really under the CNT anarchists. I mean, and they undermined the Bolsheviks in the Russian Civil War as well. I mean, this kind of left-wing politics is really
well, it's exactly why. And although Chomsky was greatly mischaracterizing Lenin as just an opportunist politician, it's exactly why he wrote something like Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder.
Yeah.
Because that sort of idea, utopianism and wanting to basically reach the end before you've taken all the steps to get there, never ends in success. But we should get wrapping up really quickly before we end. I'd like to play this clip of Chomsky where he tries to compare himself to Marx when asked about his asked about MIT's military ties. So let me just pull this up.
Oh, is this from the Foucault debate?
Yes. Here we go.
I have an additional, one small additional question or more remark to you. That is that you, with your very courageous attitude towards the war in Vietnam, how can you survive in an institution like MIT, which is known here as one of the great war contractors and intellectual makers of this war?
There are two aspects to that. One is the question how MIT tolerates me, and the other question is how I tolerate MIT. Well, as to how MIT tolerates me, here again I think one shouldn't be overly schematic. It's true that MIT is a major institution of war research, but it's also true that it embodies very important libertarian values, which are, I think, quite deeply embedded in American society, fortunately for the world. They're not deeply embedded enough to save the Vietnamese, but they're deeply enough embedded to prevent far worse disasters. And here I think one has to be a bit qualified. That is, there is imperial terror and aggression, there is exploitation, there is racism, lots of things like that. But there's also a real concern coexisting with it for individual rights of a sort which, for example, are embodied in the Bill of Rights, which is by no means simply an expression of class oppression. It is also an expression of the necessity to defend the individual against state power. Now, these things coexist, you know. It's not that simple. It's not just all bad or all good. And it's because it's the particular balance in which they coexist that makes it, that makes an institute that produces weapons of war be willing to tolerate, in fact, you know, in many ways even encouraged, to be quite honest, a person who's involved in civil disobedience against the war. Now, as to how I tolerate MIT, that raises another question. There are people who argue, and I've never understood the logic of this, that a radical ought to dissociate himself from all oppressive institutions. That is, the logic of that argument is that Karl Marx shouldn't have studied in the British Museum, which, if anything, was the symbol of, you know, the most vicious imperialism in the world, the place where all the treasures of empire were gathered, you know, the rape of the colonies was all poured in there, and so on and so forth. But I think Karl Marx was quite right in studying in the British Museum. He was right in using the resources and, in fact, the liberal values of the civilization that he was trying to overcome against it. And I think the same applies in this case.
But aren't you afraid that your presence at MIT gives them a clean conscience?
I don't see how, really. I mean, I think my presence at MIT serves marginally to, I hope a lot, I don't know how much, to increase student activism against a lot of the things that MIT stands for example.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think this has to be the end of the debate.
Yeah, anyways, so
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I watched that full debate years ago, and I found myself agreeing with Foucault more of the time, because Foucault was actually talking more about class than Chomsky was, and I don't even like Foucault at all. But no, I think that's very telling. I mean, the example he gives of Marx is interesting because in some respects, I do agree with what he's saying there as far as but you know, he's forgetting to mention the fact that Marx lived in squalor for much of his life and was like politically persecuted, and you know, Engels was the one with money and he had to help him.
well, too, you know,
Faced
Chomsky
a lot
wasn't
more consequences than Chomsky ever did. Marx
Well-
wasn't palling around with
Epstein or the equivalent of Epstein at the time. Well, too, Chomsky was actually receiving money directly from the military, so he wasn't just working at MIT while it's also a war contract. He was actually getting money from U.S. military for his linguistic work.
Yeah, I think it's you know, he really kind of I think if you did a psychological profile of Chomsky, it really is. You can see even in his own response to that question, he's sort of wrestling with it. And I think that, like Gabriel Rockhill talks a lot about in his book, if you haven't read it, on the Frankfurt on who paved the Pied Pipers of Western Marxism, he talks a lot about how we cannot separate people their as individuals from their own, you know, their political theorists, their views from their own status and position in institutions. And, you know, I guess in his third part, Rockhill is going to bring up Chomsky because he's a perfect example of how somebody, you know, his politics cannot be separated from his occupation and his standing in the world, his class position, his profession, his labor position of as a member of the labor aristocracy, kind of. You know, there is a connection there, and as shocked I was I've been a longtime critic of Chomsky, even though I've always given him his due, but even I was surprised by the Epstein revelations. I think even the most prominent critics of Chomsky were very surprised because it was like, how does he reconcile this? But at the same time, it's also not very surprising in retrospect. But yeah, we should be wrapping up. This has been a great discussion. And yeah, I mean, if anybody out there has not read Michael Parenti, we strongly encourage you to read his work. It's one of the most important political thinkers in my life, as far as influencing my writing and my political development. But yeah, thank you for tuning in, and hopefully we'll be back with our next episode sooner than the last one. If you're watching us on Substack, we have a YouTube channel. It's Captive Minds Pod. If you're watching us on YouTube, we have a Substack. It's shaenahbatterson.substack.com. Please remember to hit like and subscribe. And Shaenah, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to say that Michael Parenti was very impactful on me as well. And I think aside from being a great writer and speaker, he also was a person of integrity who's stuck by the cause for his career. And if you really want a good refutation of everything Chomsky was saying in that clip that you played, you should go and read Michael Parenti's book, Black Shirts and Reds, Rational Fascism and the Overthrow of Communism, which is a very good book, very important.
Yeah, I said this online. I don't have things go viral very often, but I had something go semi-viral when the revelations about Chomsky were really everyone was talking about a few weeks ago. I posted about how I thought I hoped that Ed Herman finally got the proper credit, for being the primary author of that book. And I'm not saying people shouldn't read Chomsky too. I think it's important people read him as well. But Ed Herman really deserves the credit for that book. And Ed Herman didn't get any of the attention, and the work that he did in the 90s, especially on Yugoslavia and Rwanda and other stuff, was, in my opinion, far surpasses anything Chomsky ever did. So thanks everyone for tuning in. We'll be back soon with another episode of Captive Minds. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.